Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning. Welcome to the final determination as to what Sinead O'Connor was. At the moment, 210 of you have voted. 37% believe she's an empath. 14% a narcissist. 6% a normal. But 43% believe that she was narcissistic, but not a narcissist. We're here to find out who is right. We're here to determine who is correct with regard to the assessment of Sinead O'Connor. If you haven't voted, make sure you do. Let's see if that changes. And it might alter as we go along. Thank you, Cast Cal, for your donation. So thank you for joining me as we now conclude the series about what Sinead O'Connor was. A substantial amount of research, time, and review has gone into making this series for you to enjoy and to provide education about not only Sinead O'Connor, but the classifications that I use. Do feel free to show your appreciation through the super thanks to ensure your glorious narrator's velvety voice remains lubricated by the finest dearths. I place people into one of four groups to enable people to understand the nature of a person and the drivers behind their behavior. When it comes to the world of narcissism, I categorize people into narcissist, empath, normal, or narcissistic. If psychopathy is present, I will also include that either as a pure psychopath or narcissistic psychopath. But since psychopathy is rarer, the base model that I use is narcissist, empath, normal, or narcissistic. Those four categories have similarities and also key differences. Understanding the relevant category provides considerable insight into why people behave as they do. We now turn to the issue of what Sinead O'Connor was. I've examined a considerable amount of evidence. This includes interviews with Sinead O'Connor, reading her memoir, Rememberings, reading news articles, interviews with her in the press, eulogies that have been given about her following her death, reports about her behavior while she was alive, the nature of her relationships, in terms of those with intimate partners, with friends, with family, and also in relation to her own children. There is a lot of evidence that I haven't included in the actual parts that you've listened to, because that would unnecessarily extend the series, but it still has been taken into account with regard to reinforcing the aspects which have already appeared and been demonstrated in the earlier parts, and therefore has been taken into account with the conclusion that has been reached. There is little doubt that Sinead O'Connor was a complex individual. Your comments have borne that out. There is also little doubt that she suffered abuse as a child at the hands of her mother. The extent of that abuse can be said, however, to vary. For instance, one of her brothers has called into question the extent of her recollections that she has exhibited. This is to be expected. People perceive reality in different ways. So there is no true objective reality. What she would see as particular behaviors towards her may well be remembered differently compared to the way that her brother saw them. She may well look at the behavior exhibited towards her through a particular lens based upon how she sees the world and how she experienced it. Her brother, for instance, may be more forgiving with regard to how he saw the behaviors and therefore saw it through a different lens. The fact remains she was abused. The extent of that abuse, well, may vary, but the fact is, it is inescapable that she suffered abuse and that it had a considerable impact upon her. It is also clear that her mother was a narcissist, that her mother behaved with an absence of emotional empathy towards Sinead O'Connor and her siblings. This means two things. The first is that there is a possibility that the genetic predisposition towards narcissism has indeed been passed on to Sinead O'Connor from her mother. And secondly, that her mother created a lack of control environment. That cannot be disputed. Those of you that follow my work will be aware that in the formation of a narcissist, you have to have the genetic predisposition and the lack of control environment. The fact that her mother was a narcissist and created a lack of control environment doesn't automatically mean that Sinead O'Connor was a narcissist. It simply means that it raises the distinct possibility that she was one. The reason that it is not guaranteed is that the genetic predisposition can sometimes be missing. It skips, goes to the other children, or could be passed on to grandchildren instead. And, or where there is a lack of control environment, there is an intervener who shields the child from the worst of the lack of the control environment, meaning it doesn't have the impact upon her. And thus, that means that a narcissist is not created. Thus, in Sinead O'Connor's case, it might be that the genetic predisposition was skipped and or there was an intervener that protected her from the worst of the lack of control environment. From the information received, I do not see that there was an intervener, meaning that she was indeed exposed to a lack of control environment, and that, therefore, increases the possibility of her suffering post traumatic stress disorder or becoming a narcissist. We are going to briefly revisit some of the categories by way of refresher for the purposes of making our way to the conclusion. Sinead O'Connor was a performer and was a provocative one. This provocation suggests an absence or reduction of emotional empathy in those that she dealt with. It is to be noted that there was little grandiosity associated with her as a performer. Many performers have strong narcissistic traits as a consequence of the necessity of exhibiting pride, vanity, showmanship, and showcasing in order to perform. There was at times a humility associated with the performance of Sinead O'Connor because she often appeared to be focused more on the performance itself and the message associated with it than the trappings that would come with the particular performance. Was this a genuine humility, though, or was it fabricated? The message appeared to be of greater importance to her, and that may well then support that she was a considerable truth seeker, or that she perhaps was often triggered by what she had experienced, with the consequence that that then drove her to deliver the message in the way that she did. She, of course, experienced fame, and that had an impact upon her, especially in the way that she described how it affected her relationship with her children, in that she felt that she was not with them as often as she might have been. We have seen as part of her behavior one very clear aspect, which was that she would regularly steal. A narcissist would engage in such behavior because they would have no emotional empathy, a sense of entitlement, a lack of accountability for their behaviors. And they would also be looking to assert control over people. And it may well be the case that O'Connor was seeking to assert control as a consequence of placating and appeasing her mother, who encouraged her to steal. A narcissistic individual would steal because they don't have any emotional empathy for the third parties affected by their behavior, and also because she wanted to please her mother. It is less likely that an empathic person would steal with the frequency and extent that she would do so, although it does remain a possibility, and again could have been driven by the desire to appease her mother, reducing her emotional empathy. Furthermore, a normal person would well engage in repeated theft and stealing because they don't have emotional empathy or very little for the affected third parties. And again, as a consequence of the fact that she would want to appease her mother. With regard to relationships, she had many of an intimate nature. Some were short lived, some certainly seemed unsuitable. But what is interesting is that with regard to her various partners, there is not a litany of criticism from them about her. Undoubtedly, they would have had their views about her privately. However, none were so moved as to speak out against her publicly. You would be hard pressed to find any of them speaking unfavorably about her, which would suggest that the nature of the relationships was perhaps that they were largely good, rather than it being repeatedly troubled and problematic. Or, where the relationship did have its problems, it may well be the case that the other person understood the reason why, and they were sympathetic to the circumstances. It's evident also that at times she sought the refuge of relationships, whilst on other occasions she was perfectly content not to be in an intimate relationship at all, and was content not to be in a relationship for some time. It's also evident that she had a great difficulty trusting people, which impacted on perhaps the length and duration of those relationships, particularly so. This is a very important point. Was this absence of trust exhibited by a narcissist, or the absence of trust originated from someone scarred by her treatment, from someone she thought that she could trust? O'Connor was a spiritual individual. Yet was this magical thinking, manifesting as spirituality for a narcissist, thus being used to pursue the prime aims? Or perhaps contagion empathy, which was manifesting instead? Or was she simply a spiritual individual who saw the advantages and disadvantages of religion and took from it what worked for her, more commensurate with a narcissistic person or someone who was normal? With regard to the controversies that manifested in relation to Sinead O'Connor, it is worth pointing out that it is quite apparent to me that many of the criticisms that she faced were as a consequence of her refusal to be quiet. Furthermore, this was also linked to the fact that she simply would not be a docile female, which is what would have largely been expected of her in Ireland. Women were expected to be quiet and play a domestic role, and were not expected or allowed to challenge institutions, especially the church. She would be expected to stay quiet. She would be expected not to challenge, and she would be expected to do as she was told. And the fact that she wouldn't, and with justification, meant that she was often unfairly highlighted as being problematic. I regard a significant part of the reporting of her behaviors to be tainted with such a view. It is clear that she was driven by a sense of injustice and the need to call out poor behavior. She didn't often appear to be particularly bothered about the reaction of people to what she had to say. She just wanted to say it. She also didn't operate with any form of facade, and furthermore, she often appeared to demonstrate accountability for her behavior in terms of the consistency by which she maintained the message she referenced. Was this a careful operation by a greater narcissist, or the genuine belief of an empath, or the attitude of, I have a message to deliver whether you like it or not, that would be shown by a normal or narcissistic person. With regard to the issue of the tributes paid towards her, these were numerous and demonstrated that very clearly, alongside the feisty behaviors that she exhibited, she was very well thought of by people. People spoke very highly of her. They recognized the downsides of her behavior and therefore didn't, in effect, gloss over that. But there was consistent praise for her as an individual in terms of her talent and the way that she behaved towards the people, and in relation to the way that she campaigned and protested. Those individuals that spoke of her demonstrated genuine affection and warmth rather, with regard to her. Turning to her mental health, it's clear that Sinead O'Connor had significant mental health issues, and this was something which caused a lot of the chaos and problems in her life. She repeatedly admitted to these issues and was most open about them. She did not appear to blame shift using these mental health issues and didn't either use them to seek sympathy, but was rather forthright about them, obvious about them, and simply saying, I have these problems and I need help. It is clear that the nature and extent of her mental health issues impacted considerably upon her behaviors. And this is something that must be taken into account in the overall assessment of her. There also appeared to be the ownership rather than exploitation of her mental health problems. Is this the more dismissive nature of a greater narcissist at work? It certainly does not fit with that of a mid range narcissist. Or instead, might this just be someone who shows accountability, pointing to empath, narcissistic, or normal? With regard to her children, it's evident that she exhibited considerable emotional empathy for her children. This was deep, sustained, and frequent. She also admitted that where she was a poor mother, and did so once again in an upfront, matter of fact manner, neither seeking to blame shift or to seek sympathy. It's noteworthy that none of her children have made any public complaint about her. It is also noteworthy that she issued a very clear and distinct desire to protect her children so that they did not suffer as she had done so, and that they did not experience what she had by the hands of her mother. She was very much fearful of behaving in the way that her mother did towards her own children. It is clear that she spoke about her children with genuine warmth and pride, and had, notwithstanding the allure of fame and the demands of touring, etc., maintained connections with her children. That is a brief reminder of some of the aspects of Sinead O'Connor's life. And at this point, it appears to have affected a shift in the voting. Hitherto, narcissistic was in front, but there's now been a movement whereby, but only just, empath leads at 41%, followed by narcissistic, but not a narcissist at 39%, narcissist at 14%, and normal bringing up the rear at 6%. If you haven't voted, and there's plenty of you listening who have not, now's your chance. You followed carefully the evidence that I have provided. It's been interesting to watch the voting pattern that has existed at each juncture after the premiere episodes. There have also been individuals who have repeatedly made mention of the fact that she was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, post traumatic stress disorder, and borderline personality disorder. Those that keep making mention of that fact are evidently not familiar with the categorizations that I utilize, thinking that those diagnoses are simply the end of the matter. They are not. Where appropriate, they can sit on top of the categorizations that I use. You are aware, of course, that I rejected the suggestion of her being bipolar and the reasons for that, and offered that in relation to the issue of borderline personality disorder, this would mean either post traumatic stress disorder, or that she was a narcissist. We now turn to the conclusion. We first consider, is she a narcissist? She clearly has narcissistic traits. They are numerous and strong. However, she has also clearly exhibited considerable emotional empathy for her children. She has exhibited remorse following her outbursts. She has showed emotional empathy, not just for her children, but for other individuals, the fathers of her children, her intimate partners, friends. She has lacked grandiosity. With regard to her relationships with the father of her children, two were described as very good and enduring, notwithstanding the demise of the intimate relationship. Two, she has admitted that they would cross the road if they saw one another, but she still did not speak ill of them as fathers, not engaging in smearing them. And there is also no public condemnation of her as a mother by any of those fathers. She was an individual that was consistent with her causes. She didn't bandwagon in the way that certain narcissists we all know about would do so. And this consistency would only be found with a greater narcissist rather than mid range or lesser. She didn't operate a facade of seeking sympathy. She didn't appear to utilize a facade at all, which would then ultimately remove a mid range or greater narcissist. And she did not engage in blame shifting. In repeated interviews which I have watched, she demonstrated accountability for her behavior. Overall, it's also the case that there was an absence of artificiality with her behavior, but instead, combative as it might have been and forthright, she nevertheless conducted herself in an authentic fashion. Accordingly, for these reasons, but primarily the presence of emotional empathy, she cannot be a narcissist, and we therefore exclude narcissist from the outcome. What about empath? She clearly exhibits empathic traits with regard to her children, her friends, the protesting that she engages in, and also her colleagues. She exhibited emotional empathy for her children, for her friends, and her intimate partners. However, she was a particularly provocative and aggressive individual, and this is beyond a level which would ordinarily be seen with empathic individuals. Now, it is important to emphasize that empaths are not saintly creatures nor docile, but the frequency of her protestations and outbursts, and the absence of empathic traits strong enough to keep them in check, is that which is greater than that would ordinarily be seen by an empathic individual. And also, the vitriol that would be exhibited towards certain individuals would be beyond that which would ordinarily be seen by an empathic individual. Where an empathic individual would fight back, it would be in a more defensive fashion, as opposed to the offensive manner that she exhibited. She frequently did not give a damn what people thought about her. Empaths do give a damn. Not in a narcissistic fashion linked to control, but because of the level of care that they exhibit for other people. She didn't give a damn about what the Catholic Church thought about her, the Irish authorities thought about her, the issues with regard to her own mental health, and this would not be seen with an empathic individual. An empathic individual, notwithstanding other conditions, would still show a greater level of consideration for the responses and reactions of other people. An empathic individual would not behave with the frequency of outbursts and forthright behaviors. The empathic traits would shape a different kind of behavior towards people. Furthermore, she didn't exhibit an addiction to narcissists. If any of her relationships were with narcissists, she did not show the usual behaviors that would be exhibited by an empathic individual, and thus there was an absence of the empathic and narcissistic dynamic. Accordingly, for these reasons, we exclude the outcome of her being an empath. Having excluded narcissist and empath, we now consider what we are left with. We are left with narcissistic, but not a narcissist, and normal. It will be worthwhile and instructive to consider what are the main characteristics of these two classifications. With regard to narcissistic, A narcissistic individual has low emotional empathy, but it does exist. They have high narcissistic traits and very low empathic traits. They have emotional empathy, but it is low. It is for very few people. And when it is exhibited, it's not extensive in its application. The individual is particularly self absorbed. They can be manipulative and know that they are, but they're not manipulative all of the time in the way that a narcissist is. There is also the absence of the addiction to the narcissist. They are frequently focused upon themselves rather than attending to the needs of other individuals in the way that an empathic individual would care about others, or a narcissist would show cognitive empathy for others, or normals would show emotional empathy for their small circle of empathy. The narcissistic person generally doesn't show much emotional empathy to anybody else other than where it suits them on an ad hoc basis. It is far from extensive or overwhelming. What about the normal? The normal has both empathic and narcissistic traits, which are generally fairly low. However, these traits are less fixed than in the case of empathic individuals or narcissists or narcissistic individuals. Remember, empaths and narcissists are effectively at the end of the scales. And whilst they will have certain strong traits, there's less latitude for movement in them. The normals are in the middle. And whilst theirs are lower, generally speaking, those traits will be adjusted by external factors, which are, for instance, environmental or circumstantial. A normal exhibits considerable emotional empathy, but only for a small circle of proximate individuals, and there is a consistent and repeated application of that emotional empathy. There is little or no emotional empathy exhibited for those outside of that circle, resulting in what can often be harsh, uncaring, and dismissive behaviors towards those outside the circle. For example, those that engage in trolling on the internet. Some are narcissists, but a lot are normals because they have no emotional empathy for the people that they are trolling because they don't know them. They're not within their circle of empathy. But that person, as a normal, would care very much for their children, their parent, example, because they are within the circle of empathy. Those within the circle would include children, parents, siblings, neighbors, colleagues, but it wouldn't include, for instance, strangers or acquaintances. The normal, to put it bluntly, is also more bullshit resistant. They don't have the addiction to the narcissist, and they are able to walk away from the narcissist more readily than an empath or even another narcissist. Sinead O'Connor had substantial emotional empathy for her children, for some of her friends, some of her colleagues, but often did not exhibit it for the outside world. She was a clear mix of both empathic and narcissistic traits, those traits being susceptible to clear swings and fluctuations as a consequence of her lifelong desire to support those affected by trauma and abuse because she wanted to get a message about what had happened to her. And whilst it was principally about her, she also recognized the impact that it had elsewhere. Her combative nature arose from an absence of emotional empathy for those outside her circle, and the impact of this trauma she experienced left her often cynical and devoid of trust in her dealings. This impacted on her behavior towards the world at large and made her look like she was at war with it. And her intimate, personal, and proximate relationships saw a different side of her altogether, save where her mental health impacted upon them. Fame at a young age affected her, but she pursued the life that she did owing to her love of the music for itself rather than the trappings or residual benefits associated with it. She was forthright. She was honest, often too honest, and clearly very much affected by the post traumatic stress disorder and health struggles that plagued her life. The effects of her post traumatic stress disorder would regularly lead her to engage in outbursts, to show a diminution of emotional empathy for family members, to show a diminution of emotional empathy for intimate partners, and its impact cannot be overstated. Based on the evidence, the outcome for Sinead O'Connor is that she was a normal with post traumatic stress disorder. That is the conclusion. Well done if you identified that she was a normal. Tough titties if you didn't. Of course, this was probably one of the more difficult ones, the more difficult individual that has been placed under the Tudor for people to identify because of the complexities and also the mental health issues that were layered on top. But nevertheless, it's an excellent and instructive series to help you understand more about the way that a person would behave and the impact that it has. I know that many of you are pleased to engage in this rather than dealing with Harry's wife, and it's unfortunate as always that not as many people would access this material in the way that they ought to do so. Nevertheless, those that you have had, I know from the comments that you have found it rewarding, insightful, and instructive. Thank you very much for joining me today and being part of this live stream to understand more about what Sinead O'Connor was. I know from the comments that for many people, she was particularly special to them and that they recognized that she had a turbulent and troubled life. The whole point of this was to undertake an objective and dispassionate analysis of her for the purposes of education. The fact is, she's not being judged. She is simply being analyzed for the purpose of education. Judgment is based upon determining whether something was good or bad, beneficial or detrimental. None of that is applicable to anybody under the Tudor scope. They are simply assessed for what they are. You can then make a determination as to what you make of that. But to describe her as being judged is quite simply the observation of a clown. This concludes the live stream. Thank you for joining me. Thank you to all of those of you that have made a donation to the Dirts Fund to ease the labored throat of your glorious narrator. Look out for who is next going to go under the Tudor scope. I know that some of you have been putting forward some interesting and current examples for me to analyze. And therefore, all it remains for me to say is thank you for joining me. I'm H.G. Tudor, the Ultra.